If you go back 20 years, college for all was the word of the day. People thought that as long as you go to college and get a 4-year degree, you're going to be fine. So we built policy and we built culture around this attitude that everybody should just go get a 4-year degree. Of course, now we fast forward 20 years and it turns out that that's not always true.
This is Manhattan Insights, a Manhattan Institute production. I'm Mene Ukueberuwa, a member of the Wall Street Journal editorial board, and your guest host for today's episode. Today, I'm joined by Senior Fellow at the Foundation for Research on Equal Opportunity, Preston Cooper. Preston's research focuses on the cost of higher education and how colleges are delivering benefits or failing to do so to students who pass through them. He evaluates colleges based on their majors and based on how they're able to help students get placed in work after graduating, and also has some ideas about how policy can help push this process in a positive direction. Hello, Preston. It's great to be with you today.
Hi, Mene. Thank you for having me on.
No problem at all. I wanted to start from a broad perspective and just talk about the direction that Americans' attitudes on higher education have trended in the past few years. It's funny to think that when you and I were growing up, it seemed almost a universal assumption that if a student was able to attend a good 4-year college and pick a major of their choice, they would be able to find gainful employment on the other end of that. Perhaps it was pricey at the time. Families had to save to send their kids to school, but they all thought of it as a positive investment if their students were going to be able to get in, and figured that they would have good work on the other end of it that would be worth the cost of attending. But it seems as if people's faith in that proposition has declined quite a lot just within the past decade. About 10 years ago, 53% of Americans believed that college was certainly worth the cost. Of course, this is a country where only about a third of Americans are going to get a 4-year degree in the first place, so it's not surprising that it wasn't higher than that, but still a majority of Americans thought that it was a good investment. Fast forward to now, and it's about 40% who believe that college is generally worth the cost, so less than majority. And I wonder what you think accounts for that decline in Americans' belief that college is going to pay off for their kids. Is it that we're seeing more evidence that has always been true about whether or not it pays off? Or is it that there's actually been a change in the return on investment to people attending school? So I'm wondering if any of that gives you ideas about how we got to this place.
Of course. Well, I think you put it very well that if you go back 20 years, college for all was the word of the day. People thought that, as long as you go to college and get a 4-year degree, you're going to be fine. And so we built policy and we built culture around this attitude that everybody should just go get a 4-year degree. And that's the way to increase incomes. Of course, now we fast forward 20 years and it turns out that that's not always true. We have rising costs of college. We have rising tuition, which often makes that college degree not worth it. And we also have a student loan issue where we have a lot of people who go to college, take out student loans under the promise that once they repay those student loans, they'll be able to repay them because the benefits of college will absolutely outweigh the costs. And it turns out that's true some of the time, but it's not always true. And we've seen that happen. We've seen people default on their student loans at very high rates. We've seen people struggle to pay them off in some cases. We've seen mass calls for student loan forgiveness. And I think this has really shaken a lot of Americans' faith in the value of a 4-year college education. But I do think that people on both sides of this debate kind of make the mistake of treating is college worth it as a binary question, because college is not a monolith. There's a lot of varied quality between college degrees at different institutions and indeed of different majors. And college is worth it some of the time. If you go to an institution with a high graduation rate and a fairly reasonable price, and you pick a major with a lot of labor market relevance, your investment in college education is probably going to pay off, and you're probably going to be able to pay off those student loans with interest. But if you go to a school where your likelihood of graduating is not great, or if you pay too much in tuition, or if you pick a major that doesn't have a lot of career relevance, that it doesn't have a lot of job prospects, it's unlikely that you're going to earn back the cost of your education. And in that case, you might struggle to repay your student loans.
Mm-hmm. And what you said at the end there about the difference in different colleges' ability to deliver a return to their students makes me think of a couple of different views about what the value of attending college is in America today. it's interesting that if you read newspapers, magazines that are covering higher education, you find these two very different strains of thought, which to me seem very difficult to reconcile. And so I want to present these to you and see how you think about both of them. One idea that's very popular is that the relative return of attending college today is higher than it's ever been because we're so far along in a transition to an information economy. People who aren't able to develop high skills find it very hard to find employment in manufacturing jobs or some of the other types of work that usually in the past made up the core of middle class employment. And so it makes a lot of sense for people to make a bet that they're going to be able to attend college, find a degree that really suits their interests, and find work in some kind of white collar field. But there's another theory which suggests that actually the American economy now is completely oversaturated by people who have bachelor's degrees. We have a lot of people taking on debt and then not being able to find any kind of white collar employment, ending up underemployed in jobs like being a barista in the city, to take one popular example. And so I wonder what you think of this. Do you have any evidence through your research or just through other things you've read about how the economy, the state of the economy today, has affected the proposition of attending college? Should more people be attending, in your view, or should fewer people be attending? And obviously, some of that's going to depend on the individual characteristics of the students. But do you have a broad view on, has college become more valuable or less?
Well, so I think that you raise a very interesting point that there are these two kind of competing strains of thought. One says that we need more education in order to meet the needs of the information economy, and the other says that we're actually oversaturated with bachelor's degrees, and a lot of people can't get jobs that will use their skills. And I think that both are true to some extent, and the way that you can kind of reconcile them is by looking at the difference between what sorts of education do employers claim jobs require and what sorts of education do those jobs actually require. So let's take the example of the position of a secretary or administrative professional. If you go back to 1990, only about 9% of secretaries had a bachelor's degree or higher. This was a job that was open to, skilled high school graduates who are willing to learn on the job. And, you might not make a fortune in that job, but you might make enough to have a decent middle class standard of living. Fast forward to today, now it's about 36% of people in this job, the secretarial work, who have a college degree. And if you look at job postings for secretaries, a majority of those job postings will request a bachelor's degree, and sometimes they'll even request a master's degree or higher. And the nature of secretarial work has changed over the years, but I would argue it has not changed in ways that would necessitate having a bachelor's degree. But what's happened is that, as the number of people with a college degree has risen over time, because we have poured a lot of, treasure into making sure everybody can get a bachelor's degree. We've poured a lot of money into making sure that that college attainment rate rises. What employers do is they say, maybe I should ratchet up the education requirements for the jobs I'm hiring for. Maybe this job that used to only require a high school degree, maybe I should slap a bachelor's degree requirement on it because then maybe I'll get better job applicants and so forth. And this creates a feedback loop. So students will see, look at all these jobs now that require bachelor's degrees. I'd better go get a college degree or else I'm going to be left behind by the information economy. So more students get bachelor's degrees. Then employers say, look at all these candidates with bachelor's degrees. Maybe I should slap a bachelor's degree requirement on these job postings. And so this kind of creates some problems because number one, this closes off a lot of middle income jobs that previously used to be open to people with only a high school education. It closes off those job opportunities if you don't have that college degree, and that denies a path to the middle class for a lot of people with only a high school education. But the second problem, which I think is somewhat less discussed, is that, if these middle income jobs are suddenly requiring bachelor's degrees, but the salaries for these jobs are not rising at a rate that is commensurate with the rising education requirements for those jobs, you end up with a lot of people who are underemployed. So people go to college, they spend 4 years out of the labor force, they take on debt, they pay tens of thousands of dollars, and they get a job that pays a salary that might be, okay if you only have a high school diploma, but if you're also trying to earn back the cost of your college education, that salary might not nearly be enough. So you end up with kind of a double whammy here. High school graduates see paths to the middle class closed off, and at the same time, college graduates end up in a lot of jobs that don't enable them to earn back the cost of their education.
Hmm. So let's look at this from the perspective of parents with students who are preparing to graduate, say their children are in high school now, haven't figured out exactly what they would like to do with their life, don't know where they would want to attend college, but know that they want to be financially secure. And that's what the parents are hoping for their kids as well. Are there particular degree programs that you could point to, particularly popular ones rather than obscure ones, that tend to deliver a good return on investment, something that a parent would encourage a student who's making up their mind, hey, you might want to look into this because it does produce good results for people who go down that career path?
So where I work, the Foundation for Research on Equal Opportunity, we've produced a database of 30,000 different bachelor's degree programs across the country, where we try to estimate that return on investment number that you referenced. So what are you going to earn over the course of your lifetime with this degree, and how does that compare to the costs of earning that degree, both the cost of tuition, the direct cost, but also the opportunity cost, the time spent out of the labor force, the lost wages from pursuing college instead of going into the workforce. And so we find that college does pay off on average, but there's a huge amount of variation. So certain majors such as engineering, computer science, nursing, business, economics, these tend to pay off across the board. Even if you're going to a less selective college, a college that doesn't appear on the U.S. News and World Report rankings, if you pick the right major, if you pick engineering or computer science or nursing, that degree is almost certainly going to pay off regardless of where you go. There are other degrees which tend to pay off in some areas and not pay off elsewhere. So take psychology, for example, which is one of the most popular majors out there. There's certainly some psychology programs where graduates get a decent return on investment, decent but not terrific. But there are a lot of programs out there where that psychology degree might not be worth the cost at all once you factor in, the cost of tuition, that time spent out of the labor force, and most importantly, the risk that you might not finish the degree at all and end up with some of the debt, some of the costs, but none of the benefits of the degree. So my advice to parents would be to think less about where do I want to send my kid to college, and think more about what are my kids' career interests, what do they want to do with their life, and you don't necessarily have to have your career path all the way planned out, but you should be thinking about what sort of interests does the student have, and what sort of pathway might be best to leverage those interests into a fulfilling and well paid career pathway. And think about that first. Think about what do I want to study? What kind of career path do I want to take, and then work backwards from there. Figure out what is the best institution, what is the best college, what is the best pathway to turn those career aspirations into reality.
I'm wondering what you see or don't see from colleges in terms of adhering to this advice, actually taking a look at the results of how students across different majors perform, and perhaps putting some kind of structure in place to encourage students, particularly ones who don't have their minds made up already, to pursue the more lucrative majors. It does seem as if we're in a situation where the incentives between the colleges and students are not necessarily aligned. The colleges profit from having students pay tuition, whether that's coming from their parents or coming from loans. And it doesn't necessarily make a huge difference to them whether the students are gainfully employed on the other end of it. And so I wonder, do you have positive examples of colleges heeding this advice and helping to encourage students to get into the majors that are going to leave them better positioned? And do you have examples of the opposite?
That's a great question. So I think, as we mentioned earlier in this conversation, public opinion has shifted a little bit, and people are no longer of the opinion that four-year college degree is going to be worth it all of the time. People do realize that I have to be selective about what sort of college and what sort of major I choose if I want to get a return on my investment. And so I think colleges are starting to pay attention to that to some degree. But as you mentioned, the incentives right now are very misaligned because right now the federal government will allow a college to access Pell Grant funding, student loan funding, tuition tax credits, all sorts of other funding streams, largely regardless of what students' outcomes are. So if a college is graduating students or potentially not graduating them at all into jobs that pay, poverty level wages, the college usually is not going to face any direct financial consequences for that. And so I think, the colleges will look at the state of affairs and say, hey, we can keep offering these degrees that just aren't worth very much and cost a whole lot because it's in the interests of our bottom line to do so. So how do you change those incentives? And are there successful examples of schools that have changed following a change in the incentives? And I think one example to point to, which I think is a great success story, is a community college in Texas called Texas State Technical College. And so back during 2010, I believe it was, the college and the legislator came to an agreement that their funding formula was going to be completely overhauled to focus on just one variable. What are students earning after graduation? So Texas, the state government would look at, the wages of students who had attended Texas State Technical College, and they'd say, okay, this school's appropriation is going to be a set percentage of those wages. So this college is only going to get paid if its students graduate into the workforce, into well-paying jobs. And so what did the college do? They looked at all of the programs they were offering and they said, hey, we have a lot of programs that are doing pretty well, that are getting graduates into the workforce, getting them good paying jobs, good middle class jobs. But we have a lot of programs where that simply isn't the case. So they shut down 13 programs that just simply didn't have any payoff for students. And they put those resources that they saved into expanding the programs that were working very well. And what happened is over the course of the decade, average starting salaries for graduates of Texas State Technical College increased by 26%, which is just, a simply enormous effect. If you offer me a way to increase wages by 26%, I would say that you're selling me the Brooklyn Bridge until I see the evidence. But, that's real evidence. That's what we saw when the institution just made the simple change of emphasizing some programs and de-emphasizing others. Now, I think the problem is that, most colleges are not relying for most of their funding on the state government. A lot of them are relying more and more on federal funding, on student loan funding, on Pell Grant funding, and tax exemptions and so forth. And that funding largely is not conditional on student outcomes. So colleges still find that they can get away with offering very expensive degrees that don't pay very much, and they face very few financial consequences for that. And I think if we want to change higher education, that's really what needs to change.
Well, I like where you ended up there because talk about consensus points. The idea that the credit system that we have in place for helping students cover the cost of college is broken is an absolute consensus point. You will not find the farthest right or the farthest left politician in this country who will say that the system we have today works well. The only problems seem to be that it is a system that works well financially for the universities, which have quite a lot of leverage and don't want to change it. And also that people can't seem to agree on what the best changes would be. And so I wonder if you have any ideas in that vein from the perspective of a policymaker here. What tweaks could we make to how particularly public loans are being given out that would help to put some pressure on these universities to encourage students into the more valuable programs that are likely to actually deliver a return and help them cover the cost of that loan?
I think it really all comes back to incentives. So right now, we mentioned the colleges have an incentive to just enroll as many students as possible, charge them as much as possible, and not really care about the outcomes. And I think the way that we can start changing those incentives is to give colleges an actual financial stake in what their students' outcomes are. So one policy idea that I like a lot is having the colleges essentially co-sign the federal student loans that their students are taking out. So if the students are taking out loans and the earnings that they get after graduation are not sufficient to make payments on those loans that will enable them to fully pay off the loans, the colleges should be financially responsible for that increment of loans that are not going to be repaid. And so suddenly what happens is that if colleges are charging too much and the debt is kind of out of whack with earnings that students are getting after graduation, suddenly the college is going to be on the hook for potentially a lot of money. So they have to say, okay, well, we either have to lower our prices or we have to increase graduates' earnings in order to make sure that we don't get faced with the federal liability. And so obviously this is something that's going to make a lot of colleges very upset because they kind of like the status quo right now where they don't really have to that they don't really have to care about students' earnings after graduation. So what I've suggested is trying to pair this stick with a carrot, which also creates the same incentives for schools to care more about their students' earnings, but does so by providing a benefit rather than necessarily imposing a cost. And so what I've proposed is what we should do is look at the Pell Grant program, which is the flagship financial aid program for low income college students. And basically allows colleges to take more Pell Grant money if they are leading to if their programs are leading to outcomes that will yield a good return on investment. So if your students are coming from low income backgrounds, you're charging them reasonable prices, and they're getting good middle class jobs after graduation, we should reward that with an additional Pell Grant bonus. So we should reward that with more aid to enable more low income students to afford those sorts of degrees that are leading to a really great return. And that could be paid for by the other half of the equation, which is the stick, which is requiring colleges to co-sign the loans that students are taking out. And so we've done the math on this, and we figured out that if you impose loan co-signing and this Pell Grant bonus at the same time, the federal government will still save money, but it will absolutely revamp the incentive for colleges on both sides. The bad ones will get a stick; they will be facing a financial liability. But the good colleges that are offering good degrees at a reasonable price, they could potentially come out ahead from this. So you'll kind of divide the colleges on this one. The ones that are doing well will be very in favor of this system, and the ones that are doing poorly will be probably very against it.
That sounds like a very fair bargain to me. On the one hand, having colleges have to take a little bit of the risk in the loans that they're accepting, which encourages them to work on behalf of these students and make sure that they're getting in position to be able to get good jobs and pay them back. And also to be providing more opportunity for low-income students to be able to attend affordably at these colleges, knowing that you have those structures in place that are going to make sure that these low-income students who are the most at risk aren't going to then graduate into a position where they're going to be less likely to be able to find good jobs and pay back those loans. So it does seem like a good combination there. I wonder, one other popular solution that gets floated is the idea of having the loans be risk weighted essentially by major. That's obviously something that you've looked at closely in terms of the payoff varying so much across different fields that students study. And it seems to be common sense to say that if you're going to give credit to a student for the sake of paying for their education, you have quite a lot of information about their ability to repay based on which major they choose. And you could potentially alter the interest rate according to the major that they choose. Is that something that you would favor? Have you looked into what the effects of it might be? And do you think that it's something possible that should be considered?
I think it's certainly, an interesting proposal. I would say that I am a little bit less trustful of the government to be able to do that effectively. I might trust a private company which has more of a direct financial interest in what the returns are going to be to do that sort of underwriting. I'm not sure I'd necessarily trust bureaucrats at the Department of Education to do it. And I think that what we should do is kind of look at, what are the outcomes of these programs and be somewhat agnostic towards what students are actually majoring in. So we should look at, what are students earning after graduation? How does that compare to how much debt they're taking on? And is that going to be a positive return on investment for them? And, I don't necessarily care if the program that is producing that positive return on investment is an engineering program or a fine arts program. Now, of course, the data show that engineering programs are much more likely to satisfy that criteria, that students are getting a return on investment. But, if a college can figure out a way to make a psychology program or a liberal arts program or a fine arts program, really pay off for students, I think that's something else that we should be encouraging. One kind of critique that I will get a lot from my research is that, well, maybe some of these degrees in, history or English or wherever don't pay off very well, but, that they have all these, non-financial benefits for students. And I think while that's true to some extent, that's not an excuse for loading students up with debt they can't repay. And there are some colleges that have figured out ways to make the English program or the history program or even the theater program in some cases actually yield a return on investment for students. It might not be an enormous return, but it might still be a positive return that will enable students to pay back their loans. And I think that's the sort of thing that we should be encouraging. We should be encouraging colleges to figure out ways to innovate to try and make these majors, which have been traditionally lower paid, get somewhat of a better return in the labor market, and not necessarily deciding on the front end that some majors are better than others, but actually looking at the outcomes and encouraging colleges to improve outcomes across a wide variety of fields of study.
So another area of this topic that I wanted to cover is how performance varies across different types of college. And one idea that I have is that a lot of the focus often goes to the most elite schools whose names are nationally known, and people know that they have absolutely eye-popping sticker prices to attend for the students. Look at a school like Stanford, to take one example at random. Probably tuition, room, and board is running you something close to $80,000 a year for an undergraduate by now. And people take that as an example of runaway college costs. But my sense is that when you actually look on the return on investment for students, you're getting it very, very high at the elite schools. These often are the ones that you least have to worry about. And I would imagine there are a couple of reasons for that. One is obviously the job networks that they're launching students into are really incredible, and people are going to get high paying positions and not have to worry about the monthly student loan payment, but also because they offer quite a lot of grants in addition to the loans. They have large endowments, they have a lot of donor support, and so you do have students who are not actually paying that full cost of attending, unless they happen to come from a very wealthy background. And so I wonder what you think about different types of schools and how they vary in how they're able to help students cover the cost of attending. Look at the elite private colleges, smaller liberal arts colleges, public universities, and the different dynamics at all of these different types of schools in terms of the costs that students face.
That's a great question. So I think I'm really glad you brought up the point of, the grant aid that is sometimes offered at these institutions. So we see that very scary looking $80,000 sticker price. Most students are probably not going to pay that full amount. A lot of these schools do offer, very generous financial aid packages, particularly for lower income students who attend there. And some low income students may even get, full scholarships, so they don't actually have to pay a cent. So it's very important to be thinking about, not just, what the sticker price is, although that's important, but also to be thinking about, what is this school actually going to cost me after financial aid. And so when we talk about, different types of schools, the one of the biggest factors in whether the school is going to be producing higher earnings, if we ignore major for a second and we just look at, what is the average earnings for this school, selectivity does play a huge role. So, Stanford, Harvard, Yale, the Ivy League schools, they're probably selecting a lot of students who have very high, academic ability, also may come from relatively privileged backgrounds and might have, existing professional connections. These are students who are probably going to be doing very well regardless. And so a lot of the high earnings that we see associated with those very elite institutions are somewhat baked in. I think when we go to the other end of the spectrum, so more open enrollment institutions, if we look at for-profit colleges, community colleges, less selective public four-year colleges, sometimes these have much lower earnings because they're taking a lot of different students, regardless of earnings potential. And so that's not necessarily it's not necessarily the school that's doing that. Sometimes it is, just the pre-existing earnings potential of the students that is making the difference there. But I do want to raise, one potential danger point in this conversation, which is that we're only talking about, undergraduate colleges here. So we're talking about the highly selective undergraduate colleges at Harvard and Columbia and Stanford. We're talking about the very less selective, undergraduate colleges at the University of Phoenix or wherever, a non-selective school. This kind of gets scrambled if we look at graduate degrees. So a lot of Ivy League schools, very elite schools, will rely on kind of the reputation of their very selective, very elite undergraduate colleges to offer sometimes these very expansive, sometimes even open enrollment or close to open enrollment graduate programs that will basically, take any student who applies, and the students there will be able to get, very large loans from the Department of Education in order to fund their graduate studies. And often the outcomes for these programs are very, very poor. So the Wall Street Journal, your newspaper, did a report a couple years back about the film master's degree at Columbia University, and this degree leaves students with an average debt of $180,000, and the starting salary for students who finish this program is just $30,000. This is an Ivy League school that dominates, the U.S. News and World Report rankings, probably as a single-digit acceptance rate for its undergraduate college. It's been able to kind of parlay the reputation of that undergraduate college into offering these, very non-selective, very expensive graduate programs, which will kind of operate like a cash cow for the university, and will end up leaving a lot of students with debt that they're just never going to be able to repay.
Well, I remember that series of reports very well that was published by the news side of the Wall Street Journal. I believe it began with the Columbia MFA program, and then it got such a broad response that people realized we really have an entire national scheme here of many different universities offering many master's programs, which are downright exploitative, it seems like, if you look at the numbers. And I couldn't agree more that they're trading on the cachet built up by their undergraduate institutions to market some of these programs that really are not delivering for students. But that idea also makes me think of the notion of the choice that students have in deciding to take on courses of study that might lead them in less lucrative fields. And so it makes me wonder if in any of your research you're able to disaggregate between majors that under-deliver based on compared with expectation versus ones where people are entering likely with the knowledge that they're going to be in a lower paying field. I can understand why that would be hard to tease out if you're looking at different majors. But are there any different fields of study that you found in your research where it seems as if it would be likely students entered this thinking that they're going to be able to find a well-paying job, something like studying business as an undergraduate, and then aren't able to, compared with things like fine arts, where a student is still paying quite a lot, they're taking on a lot of loans, but they probably know that they're going to be in a more difficult financial position afterward. And I think that's a very different distinction to draw if we can.
Yeah, that's a great point. So, kind of as we talked about earlier in this conversation, it used to be the case that people would assume if you go to a four-year college and you get a bachelor's degree, you're going to be fine largely regardless of what you major in. And I think that kind of consensus has broken down, and students themselves now realize that, there's actually a tremendous amount of variation in outcomes by major. But I think that people still don't necessarily always realize that some majors may not be delivering the sorts of returns that they promise. I think a great example is psychology. So psychology, one of the most popular majors out there. A lot of students will take, Psych 101 as a freshman, and it'll end up being a catch-all major for students who might not have a great interest in anything else, but they wanted to go to college, and so they started taking some psychology classes, and they said, okay, I kind of like this. Let me just make this my major. So this ends up as a very popular major, and a lot of students who graduate from a psychology major don't end up earning back the cost of their education, because I think the major has gotten so saturated that there simply are not enough psychology jobs to go around, simply not enough jobs that are going to use the skill set of a psych graduate, and will pay commensurate wages. So you end up with a lot of people who major in psychology graduating into a labor market that can't really use their degrees. And so they end up in a lot of jobs that typically only had required a high school degree in the past, and may not pay wages commensurate with students' expectations for being college graduates. And so I think this is kind of the number one, red flag in higher education, at least on the undergraduate side right now, is the psychology major. It's a very popular major, and too often it just doesn't deliver financial returns. Not universally so. There are some good psych programs out there, but I think the performance of this major is well below what people expect it to be.
Mm-hmm. Well, another interesting dimension here is that you have a lot of students deciding to attend college simply because they feel as if there is no alternative. And that's something that we touched on at the top of this podcast, not necessarily having really any sense of what they want to study or what field they want to enter, but really believing at their core that they're not going to find gainful employment if they don't attend a four-year school. And so I wonder what you make of something that often is suggested as an alternative, which would be vocational education, people being able to get a certification for developing skills, you generally in a practical craft, but there are all sorts of different industries that do have vocational schools that feed into them. Is this something that you have studied as well? Do you have a sense of the relative return on investment for different paths of vocational education? And is this something that has been increasing in recent years as people have become more skeptical of four-year colleges?
I think that there is absolutely increasing interest in vocational education and just college alternatives more generally. So the number of registered apprenticeships, at the Department of Labor has gone up by about 70% over the last 10 years. There are now about 600,000 active registered apprentices right now, which is a huge turnaround just even from 10 years ago. So there is definitely, rising interest in some of these alternatives, and they often do pay very good wages, and they often do have a great return on investment for students. One example that I like to point to is the Foundation for Advanced Manufacturing Education in Kentucky. They offer an apprenticeship program in advanced manufacturing. They did a study on this. The control group for students who were participating in this program made about $36,000 after 5 years. Students who actually participated in the apprenticeship, after 5 years, they were making $98,000. That's a threefold increase in salary, which is just an amazing return. You don't see effects that large, very often. So I think the big question now is, why aren't these alternatives even more popular than they are? We have seen that they do have a lot of success, especially for students who are, may not be students who are going to thrive in a traditional academic setting. I think the reason is that the funding streams for post-secondary education and training have for a very long time favored traditional four-year colleges over basically anything else. So if you want to go to a traditional four-year college and get a bachelor's degree, you'll qualify for Pell Grants, you'll qualify for subsidized student loans, you'll get tuition tax credits, you'll get federal work study, your college will benefit from direct appropriations from the state government and federal tax exemptions for its endowment and for donors. There's a whole bunch of funding that gets poured into traditional colleges. By contrast, if you want to go to an apprenticeship program, well, your apprenticeship provider has to apply for a very limited pool of funding that's available through the Department of Labor. They're often not going to get that funding. If they do get the funding, it's probably just going to be a small amount, and they have to jump through a bunch of bureaucratic hoops in order to do it. So a lot of employers and other entities that might find it optimal to offer an apprenticeship program simply don't do it because, there's just so many hoops they have to jump through with respect to funding. And so they say, okay, I'm just going to rely on the traditional higher education system to train my workers instead. The apprenticeship program that I mentioned, the Foundation for Advanced Manufacturing Education, actually elected not to apply for funding from the Department of Labor because they simply judged, the hoops we have to jump through are not worth the benefits to us. So how do we fix this? I don't think that we necessarily need to have a big new government program to fund apprenticeships or to fund alternatives to college, but what we should do is to make sure that the funding streams that exist right now do not unduly privilege one pathway over the other. So I would love to allow students to use their Pell Grants, which they can currently use at traditional colleges. They should be able to use their Pell Grants to pay for classroom components of apprenticeships. Most apprenticeships will require some time in the classroom. Pell Grants should be able to pay for that. Federal Work Study. This is a program that basically subsidizes the wages of college students who are, working in the campus library or something while they're enrolled to help pay for their studies. why can't federal work study also pay for on-the-job training or for the training wages that are paid to apprenticeships? There's lots of ways that we can use the existing system and make it less stacked in favor of traditional colleges without necessarily expanding the scope of the federal government hugely. We just need to make sure that these funding streams can be open to more alternative models.
Yeah, I mean, it seems like having relatively easy to access and robust funding for some of these alternatives to college would be a massive benefit to a lot of people who are looking to get into some of these fields. And many of these people are ending up in four-year colleges at great cost to themselves, not because they deliberately chose to go down that path, but just because it's much, much harder to be able to afford to cover the cost of getting prepared to gain the skills to go into other lines of work. And I think that it's interesting to consider one of the reasons why the return on attending some of these vocational schools is very high is not only because they're actually inculcating skills and they're matching these students up with good jobs, but also because their costs are considerably lower than some of these four-year schools. I think if you're going to learn to be an electrician, it's unlikely that your school is going to have an administrator to student ratio of 1 to 1 and is going to have all sorts of amenities that inflate the cost of attending, but are very, very unlikely to actually deliver any return there. And so I'm wondering what you think about that, if you have any view on the trend of inflated costs at a lot of these four-year schools, and if you've seen any promising examples of schools being able to tackle them, or if you think it's a problem that seems likely to continue to grow and grow and diminish the return on investment by adding to the cost side of the ledger.
It's a great question. So you're absolutely right that we have seen growth in kind of the administrative bureaucracy at a lot of four-year colleges and universities. So we did a paper about this a few years ago, and we found that over the past 20 years, 2/3 of the increase in costs per student costs at four-year colleges is down to administrative growth. There's some growth on the instructional side, but a lot of it is simply due to adding more administrators and kind of bulking up the administrative side of things. But I think this is also downstream of the incentives problem that we discussed earlier. Right now, colleges can get money from the federal government, regardless of what their outcomes are, and also regardless of what their costs are, because the federal government doesn't really look at whether the outcomes of these schools justify the costs, and so they can ratchet up tuition, they can take in more money, largely subsidized by the federal government, and they can use that to expand their administrative bureaucracies. But that it doesn't have to be this way. Colleges can choose differently, and we are seeing some start to choose differently a little bit right now. One dirty little secret that higher education hasn't really seeped out into the public mindset yet is that tuition has actually been going down since 2019 after you account for financial aid. Because schools are starting to see, college enrollment is dropping. We need to cut tuition in order to attract back some of these students who are disillusioned with a four-year college education. And one absolute leader in this space has been Purdue University under the leadership of Mitch Daniels, who just retired last year, I believe. So he came into office in 2012 to the office of the president of Purdue University. And he was looking at their budget sheets, and he saw that they had been increasing tuition year after year after year. And so he said, can we solve for zero? Can we make the increase in tuition costs from year to year zero? And what do we need to do basically in order to make that increase zero? If we're going to hold that fixed, that zero increase in tuition, what else can we do to make sure that we can hold the line on tuition? And there wasn't any, magical formula for here's how to reduce the cost of college. It was just a bunch of little things, a bunch of small acts of budget discipline, which enabled them to get costs down. One example he gives is having them mow the lawn every 3 weeks rather than every 2 weeks. There are these little luxuries that institutions can forego, and if they forego enough of them, they can actually hold the line on tuition and make college more affordable for students. And I think more and more colleges right now are waking up to that fact that they can't just keep blithely increasing tuition year after year after year, because students are eventually going to say no, and they're eventually going to say maybe college is not going to be worth the cost after all. And if you want me to come to college, you're going to have to make sure that your costs are reasonable.
Well, One of the things that we tend to count on in most fields to put downward pressure on costs is competition. But obviously, there are some problems in higher education with getting to real competition to the point that schools have a strong incentive to reduce their costs. One is that the costs are defrayed by the delay between when they're being adopted, accepted by these students, and when they're actually being paid, particularly if you have very young people making these decisions. The costs don't seem quite real to them. They want to attend their dream school. They'll sign on the dotted line and take on tens of thousands of dollars of loans, not really thinking through the burden that that's going to put on them down the road. But another reason, of course, is the availability of the credit, which makes it so that schools don't really feel as if they are facing discerning customers when that assistance is coming from somewhere else. It's much less likely that the customer is going to be as discerning as if they were bearing the cost themselves. I wonder, one of the areas where a few years ago it was suggested that competition from these inflated incumbent schools might come was online courses. The idea was that they would be able to avoid some of these same administrative costs and other costs of running essentially a home for students in addition to the actual instruction. That seems to really have tapered off, though, within the past few years. You don't hear quite as much about these massive online open courses, MOOCs as they were known, as you did a few years ago. I think one of the reasons for this is that during the COVID lockdowns, people had a big nationwide experiment in this kind of remote schooling, and students really seemed to dislike it, felt that they weren't getting anything close to what they expected out of their college experience, and also just the learning itself is more difficult to do at a distance. But I wonder if you have any faith in the idea of online instruction, or if there's any other area that you think could introduce a little bit more competition into the college cost scheme that we see today.
Yeah, so I think there is good online education and not so good online education. So I think the idea that, MOOCs are going to take over and, everything's just going to be online and it'll be the end of college as we know it, I think that has been proven that it's not going to come to pass. I think also, as you mentioned, during the COVID-19 pandemic, a lot of these traditional brick and mortar colleges that were suddenly thrown into basically operating all their classes on Zoom, not surprisingly, did not do a very good job of it. And that kind of tarnished the reputation of online education a little bit. But I also think that there are instances where online education has worked well. There are colleges such as Southern New Hampshire University, which have been working for years on trying to build up a very good, online presence, online education that actually does deliver some learning outcomes for students. And there's still work to be done, but there are ways that online education can help work out. And I think one of the ways that online education shows some promise is not necessarily when online school replaces your entire degree program, but when you take a class online that might not be offered at the institution that you're currently attending in person. So maybe there's an advanced math course or something that is not offered at your current institution, but you still want to take it for your major or for grad school or for a job or for whatever. Maybe you can take that course online somewhere else that is offering that course, and then transfer the credits to the degree that you're obtaining at your brick and mortar institution. And so what we see is that very few students do their entire degree program online. I think it's between 4 to 6% or something like that. But almost a third of students take at least one of their classes online over their 4-year college career. They take most of their classes in person, but they're taking some of the classes online to fulfill that that course that they might not be able to get in person. And I think that's where really online education can add a lot of value, because suddenly you're in a world where not every brick and mortar college has to offer every single course that they could possibly offer. Students can take courses elsewhere, transfer the credits to their home school, and the home school, the brick and mortar school, can focus on a narrower set of classes and fields of study where it really has a comparative advantage. That'll be able to reduce costs because the school suddenly doesn't have to do everything. It doesn't have to hire a professor for every single course that students could possibly want. It can focus more narrowly on a set of courses, fields of study that it's really good at, and allow students to fill in the gaps through online education. I think that is one area where there is still some promise of online education to get costs down.
And lastly, I wanted to ask from the employer side of things, if there's anything that you have seen in terms of some of these hiring institutions being more discerning about what the skills they're looking for and requirements that they're looking for, maybe deciding to drop a degree requirement if they found that it was unnecessary, particularly in the very tight labor market that we've been through over the course of the past couple of years, or maybe even creating programs of their own to help to foster the skills that they need in their workforces, which would be a favorable trend if we saw it broadly, because it would mean that students don't have to take on a lot of debt to pay for these skills themselves before being matched up with a potential employer. So are there any positive things that you've seen in either of those areas?
I think that there are a lot of, positive trends that we can point to right now. As you mentioned, the tight labor market means it's harder to hire candidates right now. So employers are saying, hey, maybe these college degree requirements that we imposed when the labor market was very slack, maybe they don't actually make that much sense at all. And maybe we should be looking to the very broad pool of talent of people who don't have a four-year degree for hiring. We've seen this especially, I think, most famously with state governments. I think the count is now 17 state governors have said that they're no longer going to require college degrees for most jobs in the state executive branch. This was a movement that began with Colorado and Maryland a couple years ago, and now has spread to, I think 17 states it is now, because they say, if this college degree requirement is actively holding us back because we simply can't hire talent if we're going to restrict ourselves to the pool of people who only have a college degree. And so we have seen that job applications to state government jobs and hiring for people who don't have college degrees has gone up over the last couple of years, which is a very encouraging trend. We're seeing this in the private market as well. So IBM, for instance, has been a big leader on this, where they've dropped college degree requirements for a lot of their software developer positions and said, we can hire people with who have been trained through alternative pathways. We don't necessarily have to restrict ourselves to people with only a bachelor's degree, and we can do very well by that. A lot of their competitors have not necessarily gotten the message, and they still require college degrees for a lot of jobs, and I think they're finding themselves a little bit behind the curve on that. So there are encouraging trends that we can point to there. I don't think that the trends we're seeing are nearly enough yet to kind of reverse the tide of degree inflation that we've seen over the last 30 years or so. The share of workers in various in certain jobs like secretarial work, as I mentioned earlier, with college degrees is still going up. Even if some of those job postings have dropped the college degree requirements. So I don't want to be too overly optimistic here, but I do think that there are some encouraging trends.
I couldn't agree more with how you put it there. It does seem as if we're going to be stuck with a bad and worsening situation in terms of the cost of college moving forward, and that puts downward pressure on the return on investment. But there are a lot of different solutions out there, both theoretical and some in practice, in terms of changing student loan structure, in terms of finding other ways for students to gain skills that seem promising. And it's just a question of which one of these is going to catch on and how policymakers can help support that process. Thank you very much for joining us, Preston. It's been really great to talk to you.
Thank you very much.
I'm Mene Ukueberuwa, and this has been Manhattan Insights.
Listeners, if you like what you heard, please feel free to write a review wherever you listen, and be sure to tune into future episodes of Manhattan Insights.